Today's gospel passage is one of my favorites from the Gospel of Mark, and it reads, "The mother of Jesus and his brothers arrived at the house. Standing outside, they sent word to Jesus and called him. A crowd seated around him told him, 'Your mother and your brothers and your sisters are outside asking for you.' But he said to them in reply, 'Who are my mother and my brothers?' And looking around at those seated in the circle, he said, 'Here are my mother and my brothers, for whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother.'" It seems a little rude at first. Um, Even more, when I got married, this was the perhaps less than traditional passage that we chose for our gospel at our wedding. Not because we wanted to insult our families or our mothers, or because we didn't think that our families or marriage were unimportant or something. But this passage, I think, gets to the importance of the goodness of family and marriage and the relative goodness of family and marriage in relation to Jesus and the gospel. And that's especially true in a world in which the slogan of family values has been used to ignore or cover over or distort the radically new way of being family together to which Jesus' gospel calls us. So let's start talking about the goodness of family and marriage. As Catholics, we think the family is a good thing. I was going to say, obviously we think that, but that isn't necessarily true. For centuries, in fact, the church has been a lot more ambivalent about marriage and families and children and all of that. And some of us were raised with or formed by a distorted theology that suggested that those with a vocation to celibacy, whether as clergy or as part of a religious community, were somehow better or holier than those of us with a vocation to marriage. And thankfully, in my opinion, we now have a better way of appreciating the diversity of different kinds of vocations in our church. But at the same time, what truth caused that distortion in the first place? In some ways, passages like this, where Jesus places firm limits on the importance of family, recognizing family's value, and yet at the same time recognizing how easily we can turn love for our own into a love that faces inward, into a love that only loves parents and siblings and spouses or children to the exclusion of everybody who's not part of our family. And this was as true in the kinship or tribally organized societies of Jesus' time and place as it is in our own time and place of sometimes isolated nuclear families, or of theologies that so idealize the nuclear family that other more expansive ways of being family are ignored. Because that's what Jesus' teaching on family opens up for us. Not a smaller, more exclusive family, but a wider, more expansive family. "For whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother," he says. When in our New Testament text, Paul or James or John write to their fellow Christians as, quote, "brothers and sisters," we hear that today as mostly being a metaphor. But in their time, they were introducing something more than metaphorical. They were introducing a radically new understanding of family and kinship. To quote Father Greg Boyle, the Jesuit founder of Homeboy Industries out in LA, "When humans tend to define ourselves as us and them, Jesus is opening up a way of being family together in which, to quote Father Greg, in which it's nobody is versus anybody." That's why we use this reading for our wedding, not because we didn't think family was important, but to remind ourselves and our guests that its importance goes beyond or needs to go beyond just the people to whom we are closest. In Christian history, celibate religious communities were often the great countersigns that pointed to the importance, the goodness of non-biological or non-marriage based families, what we might today just call families of choice. And today in our church, we also have privileged witnesses to that expansive idea of families. In the lives of some of our families who are in regular looking nuclear families, but also in the lives of single people who contribute so much to our church and world and their wider families and yet are so often overlooked. In the shared love of couples without children of their own, in families that are sometimes complicated in the eyes of the church by divorce or by LGBTQ plus identities, but whose love points the way towards that more expansive idea of family. So without going back to a world in which marriage is devalued as less than other vocations, our gospel today still challenges an ideology of family values that would betray the more expansive vision of family to which Jesus calls us. So, a question for us to pray with this week today: how are you going to love your family today, this week? both your biological family, both the people who you are closest to, but also that wider family, that wider group of people that God's inviting us to be in relationship with. For whoever does the will of God, we learn, is Jesus' brother and sister and mother.